So you started as a classical only stock investor like Warren Buffett, but you changed a lot in the last couple of years. So what was the trigger, and how did you get into macroeconomics, of course, and how did you learn about the importance of economic cycles?
So after the 2008 crash, I saw how central banks were responding to the crisis. And I kept telling myself, there's no way this fixes the inherent systematic problem that caused 2008.
Yeah.
And I knew another big event was going to happen. I didn't know what it was, yeah, or have any idea what was going to trigger it or what it was going to look like. And I would argue we still haven't seen anything yet. I think that's about to play out in a major way. But because of that suspicion that I had, and that feeling, that gut feeling that there's something systematically wrong with the global economy, I kept digging, and lo and behold, I came across a few people that I think helped me unravel what was going on a whole lot better. One of the main ones is Ray Dalio.
Okay.
Who I'm sure most people are familiar with.
Yeah.
His economic model of the economic machine, how it works, the large credit cycles, smaller credit cycles, those things had a drastic impact on how I look at investing, how I just understand how markets move, and my understanding of how currency specifically can be, and I'm going to use the word manipulated, but adjusted by central banks in such a drastic way that that you might have a great P&L on an individual company, but if you got central bankers that are flooding the system with more units, it's going to make the value of everything go up in those nominal terms. And I think that was something that I came to grips with more recently over the last 5 years that I definitely didn't have 10 years ago. And it's just changed the way I invest completely.
Okay. And considering everything going on right now in the world, where do we stay on the cycle? What do you think?
I think what's happening right now is you're at this end game scenario where interest rates are now pegged at 0%, and the central banks just don't have the capacity to keep the charade going anymore, to keep manipulating it in the manner that they were able to in the past. So let me give you an example. Back in 2008, interest rates were at 5.5%. They were able to drop interest rates, to step in at the federal funds rate, drop the federal funds rate, manipulate the market, get it going again, all those kind of things. But now we literally have globally, all the central banks around the world are pegged at 0. So they're running out of options to make it seem or appear natural. And so that's why we're seeing the quantitative easing is totally blowing and destroying the middle class, not just in the United States, but literally all over the globe. You're seeing every single country in the world talking about UBI because they have to get more liquidity into the system. So they're now at an end game. It's not just in one country, it's global. I would argue the reason that you're seeing it on a global scale, all coordinated and happening together, is because everyone was on the same monetary standard going back to Bretton Woods. We all came off collectively as a world. We came off that global currency standard in 1971. And we've all collectively had interest rates bid, which makes the yields drop. And now here we are at the end game. So I think when you look at that and you kind of see that model, it's kind of obvious to see that there's some major issues with currencies playing out right now. And I suspect that that's only going to get more exaggerated going into 2021.
Wow. Yeah, I always say, and I talked to William White yesterday, perhaps you know him. He was at the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, and at the Bank of International Settlement. He's a really great economist and dear friend. And we just came to the conclusion, actually, Weimar is everywhere right now because all the central banks have the same program. It didn't work in the past, but hey, if it doesn't work, just we keep on printing and we put just more medicine into the patient, even if it doesn't work. So, but we see the effectiveness it gets lower and lower. They pump more money in the system, they lower the interest rates, but the effect, the healing effect is not getting anywhere. So I think we're at a dead end actually with the central bank policy. So living through the end of a long-term credit cycle, which is actually happening right now. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity or experience. What do you think? How might it play out?
Well, I think your example of Weimar 1920s is actually my base case of what's going to play out, but on a global scale. And people who might hear that might say, "Oh, this guy's off his rocker. That sounds crazy, right?" But when I look at the situation that we're in, and Germany obviously was in a very different situation back in the 20s because it was pretty much Germany versus everybody else, and they were caught in a situation based on how World War I concluded. They were in a situation that there was no way they were ever going to be able to pay back their war reparations.
Yeah.
So what's fascinating is that same scenario that was playing out for Germany back in the 1920s is now playing out for the entire globe right now, based on this really unique situation where we had global coordinated monetary policy for 80 years. And so I think because we're in a situation where every country has an incentive to devalue their currency, because what it does is it drops the price of their goods and services. It sucks other competing currencies into their country, and they benefit from that. They're engineering, and what's happening is you're in a situation where it's a tragedy of the commons, but it's a tragedy of the commons amongst monetary policy between nation states. And so how does something like that end? And so when I run the game theory on how something like that ends, it ends in total disaster unless something can come along and stand up as a new currency. Now, there's talk. I know Jim Rickards is a person who brings up this idea of potentially the SDR stepping in, becoming a new currency. My concern with that idea, and I have great respect for Jim, we're personal friends. My concern with that idea is it requires coordination amongst all parties, amongst all nations, to come to the table and say, "Hey, I'm going to trust you. Let's start this over again," right? And not only does it require the trust of them to start it all over again and to trust each other, but it also requires them to drastically, in a 180, change their spending habits fiscally, right? And I just don't see that playing out. I think that when I run the game theory on that, I'm saying that's never going to happen. Like the odds of that are 1% or less. So that leads me to, all right, so if all the nation states aren't going to be able to come together and come to an agreement on this new currency or this new policy for what money is, what about something that would be completely decentralized, or something that they don't necessarily have a choice in the matter, like technology stepping in and providing this peg? And in my opinion, that's my base case scenario of what's going to play out is we're going to see Bitcoin step in and provide the new money, the new currency, and the new standard globally. And it's going to be similar to how nation states are devaluing their currency now. They're going to get into a competitive situation where they're trying to acquire as much of this as possible. And I'm talking about Bitcoin, because they're going to see, again, it's another tragedy of the commons. The longer you wait to not own this, the more harm you're just doing to yourself as a nation state.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We'll talk about Bitcoin, of course, later in the interview. But perhaps already the central banks or the government started buying Bitcoin. Who knows? Yeah, I think Bulgaria and perhaps Kazakhstan, they already own some of Bitcoin. So yeah, that's interesting. So you expect hyperinflation actually, because Weimar was the typical case, the ideal of a hyperinflation. So what do you think? How would a hyperinflation play out today in our world?
So when you say hyperinflation, I think it's really important to characterize what you're saying is going to be hyperinflating against. So when I say hyperinflation, I'm comparing fiat currencies to Bitcoin. And I would argue we've already seen this hyperinflation play out for 10 years now. I mean, I've owned Bitcoin since 2015, and I've watched the value of it go up well over 10,000% in my own portfolio for the position that I've had. And I will calmly call that hyperinflation. So, you know, if you're saying it's going to hyperinflate, the fiat money is going to hyperinflate versus the price of oil, maybe not. But I can tell you, if you're valuing your oil with Bitcoin, it's hyperinflating. So I think that's really important, because I think when you get around a lot of people in traditional finance, they'll say, well, we have nothing close to hyperinflation. And in fact, we have deflation, right?
Yeah.
And what I would tell you is, having had a lot of these conversations for the last decade, the one thing that I can tell you that I think is most misunderstood is the definition of inflation and deflation. And Jeff Booth is a guy who wrote a phenomenal book. It's called The Price of Tomorrow. He talks a little bit about this idea. And if you don't get the terminology right on some of these things, these ideas of inflation, deflation, what you're referencing it to, it's going to be really hard to understand how things are going to play out moving forward. So going to the essence of your question, when I think about Bitcoin taking over and becoming the new unit of account for people to want to settle in, the value of things are going to be a little difficult to understand. So like when I think about a house, the value of, let's just say you have a $300,000 house, and you think, well, what's going to happen to the value of that house in 5 years from now if this scenario that I'm describing with Bitcoin taking over is a real scenario? Well, I would tell you that the value of that house in Bitcoin terms, you know, it's only going to get cheaper if you're paying with Bitcoins to buy that house, and it's going to get cheaper and cheaper in a drastic way. The other thing that's going to be probably the biggest piece of all of this is all the debt that's denominated in the world right now is denominated in fiat.
Yeah.
So we've got, let's just call it $100 trillion as the number. It's all denominated in fiat. So if everyone has a mad rush, just like we saw in Germany in the 1920s, a mad rush to get out of the paper mark and get into some other alternate currency, call it the dollar or whatever. The dollar was, gold, the dollar, those were very popular currencies to have as your unit of account if you're going back to early 1920s Germany.
Yeah.
And I think what you're going to find here in the coming year, in the coming year to 5 years, you're going to see a big push for companies to start moving towards Bitcoin as their settlement layer. And when you see that happen, you know, so back to the house example that I'm trying to explain here. So if you were highly levered in the ownership of that house, let's say you borrowed 80% and you only put 20% down, you continue to have a job, you start transitioning to a unit of account of, call it Bitcoin. It's going to be, and the value of that keeps going up. It's easier and easier for you to settle that sure. debt that you have, that debt burden that you have that's denominated in fiat, because you're not going back to the negotiation table on a loan that you took to say, hey, I don't want it denominated in fiat anymore. I want it denominated in Bitcoin, which is hyperinflating against fiat. That's never going to happen. So I think you're going to have an interesting dynamic kind of play out there. I see anybody who's owning a lot of bonds that they're going to be completely impaired, probably in short order, probably in the next 5 years, they're going to be almost completely impaired in reference to Bitcoin.
Yes.
And that's the really important point, because if you continue to use fiat as your unit of account, none of this is going to, you're not going to see the hyperinflation whatsoever. But I think once people start making that jump and they start seeing how powerful the technology is, and they see more and more billionaires and companies, and soon you're going to start to see tech companies that are putting this on their balance sheet. And then at that point, I think it starts becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.